There are stages to empath healing, and most people never get past the first few. They learn some boundaries, they stop absorbing quite as much, they become slightly less available to be exploited. This is progress, but it's not completion. Carl Jung discovered that empaths who went all the way, who completed the full healing journey rather than stopping at partial healing, transformed into something that was barely recognizable as the same person who'd started. Not because they'd lost their empathy, but because they'd become integrated versions of themselves where every capacity they possessed was finally available and wielded consciously. Jung called this the final form, the completion of transformation where wounded empath became sovereign empath. And sovereign empaths, he observed, were forces that unconscious people couldn't comprehend, manipulate, or contain. Jung spent decades documenting what complete psychological transformation looked like. And what he found was that most people never reached completion. They'd transform partially, making some changes, healing some wounds, developing some new capacities. But they'd stop before the full transformation occurred, usually because continuing required losses they weren't willing to accept. But the rare ones who continued all the way, who paid every cost and completed every stage, they emerged as fundamentally different beings. Not better morally, not more spiritually evolved, just complete where they'd been fragmented, integrated where they'd been split, sovereign where they'd been dependent. Today I'm going to show you what the final form of the healed empath actually looks like according to Jung's framework, why this completion is both achievement and sacrifice, and what separates those who reach final form from those who stop at partial healing. Because if you're an empath who's been healing for years and you're wondering if there's more, Jung would tell you there is. There's a final stage where everything you've developed crystallizes into permanent transformation that can't be undone, and reaching it requires one last release, letting go of who you used to be completely, including the parts of that old self that other people loved and needed you to remain. Before we understand the final form, we need to see what Jung meant by completion versus partial healing. Partial healing, in his observation, was when empaths address some wounds, but not others. They learn boundaries with strangers, but not with family. They stopped absorbing most people's emotions, but still absorbed their partners. They could protect themselves in professional settings, but remain permeable in intimate relationships. They'd transform significantly, but incompletely. Some areas of life showed healing, while others showed continued woundedness. This partial healing was valuable and difficult to achieve. Jung didn't minimize it, but he distinguished it from complete healing, what he called the final form. Complete healing meant there were no areas where old wounded patterns still operated. Boundaries existed in all contexts, not just some. Empathy was differentiated across all relationships, not just selected ones. Self-abandonment had ended completely, not just reduced. The transformation was total, leaving no pockets of continued woundedness that could be exploited or that would cause suffering. Jung emphasized that reaching final form required something most people couldn't accept: complete willingness to be transformed even when transformation cost everything familiar. Partial healing let you keep parts of your old life, old identity, old relationships. Final form required letting all of that go if it couldn't survive your complete healing. And most empaths, when faced with that requirement, chose to stop at partial healing rather than lose everything to reach completion. The first quality that defines the final form of a healed empath is what Jung called unshakable center. Partially healed empaths had developed some stability, but it was conditional. They were stable in certain environments, around certain people, when circumstances were supportive. But fully healed empaths had developed center that was unconditional. They were stable regardless of environment, regardless of who was around them, regardless of circumstances. Their stability came from internal integration so complete that nothing external could destabilize it. Jung observed this unshakable center manifested in specific ways. Fully healed empaths could be in chaotic environments without becoming chaotic. They could be around dysregulated people without becoming dysregulated. They could face crisis without losing their grounding. They could encounter their own triggers without being controlled by them. Not because they'd become numb or disconnected, but because they'd integrated themselves so completely that they had core self that persisted through everything. This center wasn't something they had to work to maintain. It wasn't effort or practice, though effort and practice had built it. It was stable structure that existed automatically. They didn't have to remind themselves to stay grounded. They were grounded as default state. They didn't have to consciously maintain boundaries. Boundaries were inherent to their structure. They didn't have to work at not absorbing. Non-absorption was natural. The center was permanent, requiring no maintenance because it was a result of complete integration rather than practiced behavior. The second quality that defines the final form is paradoxical presence, simultaneously deeply engaged and completely detached. Jung observed that partially healed empaths usually leaned one direction or the other. Either they were engaged but still getting enmeshed, or they were detached but disconnected. They couldn't hold both. But fully healed empaths existed in what Jung called the paradox. They were completely present and engaged with life while simultaneously maintaining perfect detachment from outcomes, others' perceptions, and their own ego investment. This meant they could care deeply about people without needing those people to be different than they were. They could invest fully in projects without their worth depending on the project succeeding. They could engage in relationships without losing themselves in them. They could feel everything without being controlled by feeling. They existed in state where total engagement and total detachment weren't opposites but complements. They were all in and completely free simultaneously. Jung noted this paradoxical presence was incomprehensible to people operating from ego consciousness, because ego consciousness created either or. Either you care or you don't. Either you're invested or you're indifferent. Either you're involved or you're withdrawn. But fully healed empaths transcended this binary. They cared completely while being completely unattached. They invested fully while being perfectly okay with any outcome. They engaged totally while remaining internally free. And this paradox was marker of final form that partial healing never achieved. The third quality that defines the final form is complete integration of power and compassion into single force. Jung observed that partially healed empaths usually kept these separate or alternated between them. They were either compassionate and somewhat powerless, or powerful and somewhat harsh. They couldn't be both simultaneously. But fully healed empaths had integrated power and compassion so completely that they became inseparable. Every act of compassion was empowered. Every exercise of power was compassionate. This integration meant they could set fierce boundaries from place of love. They could walk away from people they cared about, because walking away was most loving thing. They could refuse help to someone in need, because refusing would promote that person's growth. They could be ruthlessly honest from deep care. They could protect themselves while maintaining genuine compassion for those they were protecting themselves from. Power and compassion weren't in tension. They were unified expression of integrated wholeness. Jung emphasized this integration was what made fully healed empaths genuinely effective rather than just well-intentioned. Wounded empaths were compassionate in ways that enabled dysfunction. They absorbed pain without requiring growth, gave endlessly without demanding reciprocity, loved in ways that allowed continued harm. But fully healed empaths were compassionate in ways that promoted health. They held space for pain while requiring responsibility, gave generously while expecting respect, loved in ways that demanded mutual care. Their compassion was empowered, and their power was compassionate. The two had become one. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The fourth quality that defines the final form is what Jung called transparent authenticity. Partially healed empaths had become more authentic, but still strategic about what they revealed. They were real with some people, performed with others. They showed authentic self in safe contexts, maintained masks in threatening ones. But fully healed empaths had moved beyond strategic authenticity to transparent authenticity. They were completely themselves in all contexts without needing to manage perception or protect themselves through performance. This didn't mean inappropriate disclosure or lack of discretion. It meant their authentic self was so integrated, so complete, so solid, that they didn't need to hide or adjust it for anyone. They were the same person with everyone, not revealing everything to everyone, but being fundamentally themselves regardless of context. They didn't perform different versions of themselves for different audiences. They didn't modify their essence to fit situations. They were transparently who they were. And that transparency was possible because their authentic self was unassailable. Jung noted this transparent authenticity was threatening to people who expected empaths to perform. Family members wanted the accommodating version. Friends wanted the endlessly understanding version. Partners wanted the emotionally available version. But fully healed empaths were just themselves. Sometimes accommodating, sometimes not. Sometimes understanding, sometimes boundaried, sometimes emotionally available, sometimes not. They were complex, complete humans rather than reliable performers of expected roles. And this completeness made them unpredictable to people who needed them to be controllable. The fifth quality that defines the final form is immunity to psychological manipulation of any kind. Partially healed empaths had developed immunity to some manipulation. They recognized guilt trips. They saw through obvious gaslighting. They resisted basic emotional blackmail. But fully healed empaths were immune to all manipulation, including sophisticated forms that partially healed empaths still fell for. They could be manipulated through guilt, through appealing to their compassion, through making them doubt their perception, through any mechanism. This complete immunity came from several integrated qualities. They knew themselves so completely that no one could tell them something about themselves that would make them doubt their self-knowledge. They had integrated shadow so thoroughly that accusations of darkness didn't destabilize them. They had such solid boundaries that pressure to violate them was ineffective. They were so clear on their values that attempts to make them act against values were obvious. They developed such precise discernment that they saw manipulation immediately and in its entirety. Jung observed this immunity made fully healed empaths essentially ungovernable. You couldn't control them through any of the mechanisms that controlled most people. You couldn't guilt them into compliance. You couldn't gaslight them into doubting themselves. You couldn't use their empathy against them. You couldn't leverage their compassion to exploit them. They saw through everything and remained unmoved by attempts to manipulate. Not cold, just completely clear and completely protected by that clarity. The sixth quality that defines the final form is what Jung called sovereign joy. Happiness that isn't dependent on circumstances being good. Partially healed empaths felt better than they had when wounded, but their well-being still fluctuated based on external conditions. Good circumstances, good mood. Difficult circumstances, difficult mood. But fully healed empaths had developed quality of joy that existed independent of circumstances. Not that they were always happy, but they had baseline contentment, sense of being okay regardless of what was happening externally. This sovereign joy came from complete acceptance of reality as it was, rather than constant resistance to how it was. They weren't fighting against life, trying to make it different, needing it to be better before they could be okay. They were okay with what was, including difficulty, including pain, including things not working out how they wanted. They'd made peace with being human in a challenging world, and that peace created joy that circumstances couldn't threaten, because it wasn't based on circumstances being pleasant. Jung noted this sovereign joy was confusing to people who equated happiness with having what you want, because fully healed empaths could be deeply content while not having much of what they wanted. They could be joyful despite difficulty. They could be at peace despite loss. The joy wasn't about having good life. It was about accepting whatever life they had. And this acceptance-based joy was stable in ways that circumstance-based happiness never was. The seventh quality that defines the final form is complete transcendence of need for external validation, while remaining open to connection. Partially healed empaths had reduced their need for validation, but often achieved this by becoming somewhat closed off. They needed approval less because they'd withdrawn from caring what others thought. But fully healed empaths had transcended need for validation while remaining completely open. They didn't need others' approval, and they were still genuinely interested in others' perspectives. They didn't require validation, and they were still deeply relational. This combination seemed paradoxical. How could you be completely free from needing validation while remaining open to others? Jung explained that the freedom came from internal validation being so solid that external validation was irrelevant. And the openness came from not being defensive. When you didn't need validation, you had no reason to defend against others' perceptions. You could hear criticism without being threatened. You could receive feedback without being destabilized. You could consider others' views without needing to adopt them or reject them defensively. This transcendence of validation, need while maintaining openness, made fully healed empaths extraordinary in relationship. They could be deeply intimate without being dependent. They could care about you completely without needing anything from you. They could hear you fully without needing you to hear them. They were psychologically complete, which meant they could connect from wholeness rather than from need. And connections from wholeness were categorically different from connections from need. The eighth quality that defines the final form is irreversibility, They cannot go back to who they were. Jung observed that partially healed empaths could regress. Stress could return them to old patterns. Certain relationships could pull them back into wounded behaviors. Sufficient pressure could make them abandon themselves again. But fully healed empaths had crossed threshold where regression was impossible. They couldn't go back to wounded patterns, even if they wanted to. The transformation was complete and permanent. This irreversibility came from complete integration. When you'd partially healed, old structures still existed, dormant but present. Pressure could reactivate them. But when you'd completely healed, old structures had been dismantled entirely and replaced with new integrated structures. There was nothing to regress to. The wounded version no longer existed as possibility. You could only move forward from integrated state. You couldn't move backward to fragmented state because fragmented state was gone. Jung noted this irreversibility was both liberation and isolation. Liberation because you were permanently free from patterns that had tortured you. You couldn't be manipulated back into self-abandonment. You couldn't be pressured back into boundary violation. You couldn't be guilted back into overgiving. The wounded behaviors were impossible, not just difficult, but it was also isolation because you were permanently different from who you'd been and from most people around you. The bridge back to your old self was burned. You were committed to who you'd become because becoming someone else was no longer possible. Here's what Jung discovered about what reaching final form requires that most empaths can't accept. Complete willingness to lose everyone and everything from your old life if your healing makes those things incompatible. Partial healing let you keep most of your life. You made some changes, lost some relationships, but maintained continuity. Final form required willingness to lose everything. Every relationship built on your woundedness. Every role based on your self-abandonment. Every identity constructed around your permeability. Every comfort found in your old patterns. Most empaths couldn't make this trade. They wanted healing, but not if it cost them their family, their partner, their friend group, their career, their identity. They wanted transformation, but only if they could keep most of their life intact. And this wanting to keep things was precisely what prevented final form, because final form required complete release of everything that couldn't survive total healing. And most empaths, when they saw what total healing would cost, chose to stop at partial healing rather than lose everything. Jung emphasized he had no judgment about this choice. Final form wasn't morally superior to partial healing. It was just complete where partial healing was incomplete. And completion required sacrifices most people reasonably decided weren't worth making. But for those who did continue, who were willing to lose everything, who crossed every threshold, who paid every cost, what they became was worth everything they'd lost. They reached state that was unassailable, complete, permanent. They became their final form. If you're an empath who's been healing for years and you're wondering if you've reached final form, Jung would tell you to check for these 8 qualities. Unshakable center that's unconditional and automatic. Paradoxical presence, engaged and detached simultaneously. Complete integration of power and compassion into unified force. Transparent authenticity across all contexts. Total immunity to psychological manipulation. Sovereign joy, independent of circumstances. Transcendence of validation, need while maintaining openness. And irreversibility, incapacity to return to wounded patterns even under pressure. If you have some of these qualities but not all, you've achieved partial healing, which is valuable achievement, but you haven't reached final form. And reaching it requires identifying what you're still holding on to from your old self that prevents complete transformation. What relationships are you maintaining that require your woundedness? What identities are you protecting that are based on your old self? What comforts are you clinging to that keep you partially fragmented? What are you unwilling to lose that would need to be released for complete healing? Jung believed that answering these questions honestly revealed what stood between current state and final form. And then you had choice: continue toward completion, knowing what it would cost, or stop at partial healing and accept that some transformation remained incomplete. Neither choice was wrong, but knowing which choice you were making was essential, because pursuing complete healing while being unwilling to pay complete cost created suffering. You were trying to reach destination while refusing to travel the last part of the journey that required releasing everything from the old destination. If you've reached final form, you recognize yourself completely in these 8 qualities. You have unshakable center that's automatic. You exist in paradox of engagement and detachment simultaneously. Your power and compassion are unified. You're transparently authentic everywhere. You're completely immune to manipulation. Your joy is sovereign and circumstance independent. You've transcended validation need while remaining open, and you couldn't go back to wounded patterns if you tried. This is who you are permanently. This is your final form, and you know what it cost. You lost relationships that required your woundedness. You released identities based on your old self. You walked away from everything that couldn't survive your complete healing. You paid the full price. And you discovered that what you became was worth everything you lost, because partial healing felt like improvement. But complete healing feels like coming home to yourself after a lifetime of exile. It feels like being who you were always meant to be before wounding taught you to be something else. Jung documented the final form because he wanted empaths to know completion was possible and what it required. He saw too many empaths stop at partial healing because they didn't know there was more, or because they weren't prepared for what reaching more would cost. He wanted them to have complete picture, what final form looked like, what reaching it required, what it cost, and what it provided, so they could make informed choice about how far to take their healing journey. The final form of the empath after healing is not who you used to be. It's not even an improved version of who you used to be. It's complete transformation into integrated being who has qualities the wounded version couldn't imagine. You're unshakable, paradoxical, integrated, transparent, immune, joyful, validation-free, and permanently changed. You're everything you could become once you released everything that prevented you from becoming it. And while the journey to get here cost you everything familiar, what you became makes every loss worth having experienced. Welcome to final form, if you've reached it. Welcome to completion of transformation that most begin but few finish. Welcome to being who empaths become when they go all the way through healing rather than stopping at partial transformation. You're not who you used to be. You're not who anyone expected you to become. You're who you actually are when everything false has been burned away and only integrated truth remains. This is final form, and it's permanent. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.